always sat next to him, on the chair that was just a little lower, so it was easier to reach across and serve him his food. 30 years like that. And no one ever asked if my back hurt. If you've ever lived so much for others that you forgot how your own voice sounds. Leave me a note below. Maybe, in a way, we're sharing an old cup of tea together, in a kitchen filled with quiet. The morning breeze still finds its way through the window slats like it did when I was young. But now, I sit alone, and even my memories seem to shiver beside me. I wake up before the sun. Old habits, they say, die harder than love. I move through the kitchen with bare feet and soft steps, the way I always have. The kettle hums low, the steam curls, and I place 2 cups on the table. One for him, one for me. He doesn't drink tea anymore. Said it tastes like nothing. Still, I pour it. I make breakfast the way he likes it, eggs firm, no yolk showing, toast just 1 shade before burnt. He doesn't say thank you. He never did. That used to hurt. Now, I just listen to the clink of forks, the scrape of chair legs, the sound of food being chewed in silence. That's how I know he's there. The house is quiet in the way long marriages are. Not loud with anger, not warm with laughter, just used. Sometimes I miss the days when the walls echoed with the giggles of our daughter. Even the shouting felt more alive than this hush. I sit at my usual place, just a little lower than his. The legs of my chair are uneven, one side shaved down by time and habit. I never replaced it. He never noticed. I sit there out of instinct now, as if it's the only spot that fits me. Neighbors sometimes ask me, half jokingly, "How do you put up with him all these years, that grumpy old man?" And I always smile, same way I did when I was younger. He's not so bad. I'm used to him. But used to something doesn't mean it's good. You can get used to the cold if you stay in it long enough. He used to bark at our daughter for being too loud, too slow, too much. I'd scold him gently, then tuck her in quietly, explaining that he didn't mean it like that. He always meant it like that. And I was always the one, smoothing over the splinters. That became my role, the soft one, the quieter chair, the steady presence behind him. Sometimes I wonder when that started. When did keeping peace become my whole personality? Once I dreamed big things. Now I just hope the kettle doesn't break. And even if it did, I'd still boil water in a pot. Because that's what women like me do. We adjust. The wind nudges the window again, and I close my eyes. There was a time I used to hum in the mornings. I wonder when I stopped. I married young, too young to know what I was giving up, old enough to never get it back. One day, I was a girl walking barefoot down a dusty school road, humming to myself and dreaming about becoming a teacher. The next, I was someone's wife. He said, "You'll come with me to the village. It's quieter, better for a family." And just like that, I left my books, my unfinished education, and my mother's hesitant eyes behind. The first years were hard. He worked odd jobs, on the farm, in construction, sometimes gone for days. I cooked what I could. Potatoes, rice, bits of dried fish. If there was only 1 egg, I gave it to him. He needed strength, I told myself. And hunger became a quiet thing I tucked under my apron, next to my pride. There was a winter he got sick. Fever, chills, coughing that shook the walls. I stayed up 3 nights straight, boiling rice into watery porridge, pressing cool cloths to his forehead, whispering small prayers between each breath. When he got better, he stood up and said, "You didn't ruin the rice, did you?" "No, thank you. No look, just the usual gruffness." I smiled anyway. Somewhere I'd learned that love doesn't always come wrapped in sweetness. Sometimes it comes in duties done without praise. When our daughter was born, I told myself I'd return to work when she could walk, then when she could talk, then when she started school. But one need led to another. Homework, fevers, new shoes, parent meetings. Years passed, and I never returned to anything except the stove and the laundry line. Sometimes I ran into old classmates at the market. One of them, Lynn, asked once, "Do you still sing? You used to sing all the time." I laughed awkwardly. "It's been a while. I guess I forgot the lyrics." But the truth was, I forgot how it even felt to open my mouth and make sound just for me. Singing became like silk tucked too long in a drawer. You know it's soft once, but it doesn't touch your skin anymore. People praised me for being a good mother, a devoted wife, and maybe I was. But devotion can be dangerous when it turns you invisible. Sometimes, when I passed the hallway mirror, I'd catch a glimpse and think, who is she? When did her shoulders start to slope like that? Why do her eyes look like she's waiting for something that never came? One morning, I looked straight into that reflection. I smiled, tried to hum, but the sound cracked halfway through, like an old radio forgotten in a dusty attic. That was when I realized I hadn't just stopped singing. I'd stopped being the woman who even wanted to. My daughter came home last weekend. She lives 2 cities away now, busy with her own children, her own life. I never expect much. A phone call is enough, but when she said, "Mom, I'm coming for dinner," I felt something flicker inside me, like a match I hadn't struck in years. I cleaned the house as if royalty were coming, polished the floor, trimmed the flowers outside, cooked every dish she liked, even the soup with the lotus seeds that takes 2 hours and constant stirring. My back ached halfway through, but I didn't mind. Pain becomes bearable when it serves love. When she arrived, I kissed her cheek and quickly went back to the kitchen. That's my place, behind the steam, beside the stove. That's how it's always been. Her father sat in his usual spot, already flipping through the television channels. He barely looked up when she walked in, just a grunt. I heard her sigh. Soft, barely noticeable, but I heard it. I always hear the soft things. I've lived among them my whole life. As dinner began, I did what I always do. Brought out the rice, served him first, then stood by the stove, wiping my hands on the edge of my apron. My chair, as usual, was pushed to the corner, lower than his, closer to the kitchen door. Convenient. Quiet. But this time, my daughter did something different. She walked over, pulled the chair out, and said, "Sit here, Mom." Then, without asking, she adjusted the chair legs. She propped a folded towel under the short side so it didn't wobble anymore. Now it stood equal. Now it stood firm. I hesitated. "Come on," she said, smiling gently. "You shouldn't eat like that." I sat down, awkwardly. It felt strange. The table looked different from here. Balanced, level. I'd never noticed how tall his chair was, or how much lower mine had been all these years. Then she did something that made my hands tremble. She poured 2 glasses of wine, then lifted one toward me. "To you," she said, "for always feeding everyone else first." Her father paused, brow tightening. He didn't speak, but his silence pressed against the air like a heavy curtain. Still, she didn't look away. She clinked her glass against mine. I almost dropped it. My fingers shook. That toast, that chair, that moment. It broke something open in me, not loudly, not violently. Just a small crack, like ice melting inside stone. All these years, I was careful not to take up space, careful not to ask. And in one simple act, she looked at me, not as a shadow behind someone else, not as a background hum to a louder voice, but as a person. I drank slowly, quietly, but my heart was screaming inside. For once, I was not invisible, and from that night on, something deep within me began to shift, like a tiny crack in a wall that had held too much silence, a crack that would only grow. After dinner, I stayed behind in the kitchen. I told them I'd clean up. Old habits die slow. But the truth was, I needed to sit somewhere no one could see me. My daughter had already gone upstairs to rest. My husband returned to the living room, TV humming in its usual lonely rhythm. I sat on the small wooden stool near the sink, the one with a crack down the middle. I've sat there for years, while peeling ginger, while rubbing stains out of shirts, while waiting for the kettle to whistle. It knew the shape of me better than any mirror ever did. My hands rested in my lap. I wasn't crying at first, just staring at the table. Then I looked over and saw the old chopsticks, the ones he refused to replace. The ends were chipped, stained darker with age and sauce and time. I'd once suggested buying a new pair. He waved the idea off. Still works, no need to waste money. That was his way. Practical. Cold. Never cruel in the obvious sense. But never warm either. The tears came before I even knew I was feeling them. They didn't fall in sobs. Just slowly, steadily, like tea spilling over the rim of a too-full cup. I thought of my 50th birthday. He forgot. I reminded him that morning, gently. He frowned and muttered, "Buy some food if you want to celebrate. Get what's easy." So I cooked for myself, made my own cake, washed the dishes when it was over. Not even a flower, not even a word. And I convinced myself it didn't matter. But sitting there now, I felt the weight of that forgetting. I felt it not just in my chest, but in my bones. 50 years old, half a century. And all I got was permission to cook for myself. It was never hate. That's what makes it harder to explain. It was absence, dismissal. A life where I was tolerated, kept around like furniture, reliable, familiar, easy to ignore. I was the woman who never made a fuss, who never asked for more. I told myself that made me strong, but now I see what it really was. I had lived my whole life in a way that made me small, so small that even I began to forget I needed space. I used to believe I was being kind, giving everyone comfort, not being a burden. But maybe I was just afraid of taking up room I thought I didn't deserve. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed beside the man I'd followed through decades. His back faced me, as always. The wind outside whispered through the trees, brushing against the window like fingers that remembered my name. It felt like someone was trying to speak to me. Or maybe it was me, finally trying to listen. The next morning, I opened the old wooden drawer beneath the stairs, the one that creaked like it remembered things I had tried to forget. Inside were dozens of photos stacked in loose piles, some curled at the edges from age and heat. I hadn't touched them in years. I sat down with them at the table, tea untouched beside me as I sifted through the quiet decades, smiling faces, birthday cakes, school certificates. So many moments. But in photo after photo, I noticed something. I wasn't there. Not really. I was the one behind the camera. Or blurred in the corner, one foot cut off, half turned away. The main faces were always the same. Him, proud and stiff in every picture, and our daughter, bright-eyed and beautiful, her father's hand resting on her shoulder. I found one from the day she passed her entrance exams. I still remember that day. How I waited at the gate with cold towels and sweet rice, how I rubbed her back while she cried tears of joy. I cooked her favorite dinner, put flowers on the table. And then he called his siblings, bragging, "She gets her brains from me." He never said my name, never once mentioned how many nights I stayed up tutoring her, correcting her grammar, reboiling water for her tea. It wasn't anger I felt now, just an ache. Like something I'd carried too long was finally pressing into the skin. I looked down at my hands. The skin had grown thin like old paper. Lines ran deep across my knuckles. These were the hands that had braided hair, buttoned school uniforms, wiped fevers and tears and sweat. Hands that had cooked for people who never asked what I liked to eat. Hands that had held pain without ever letting it spill out. No one ever asked me, "Mom, are you tired?" Not once. And yet, I don't blame them. Not my daughter, not even him. I made it too easy. I kept saying, "I'm fine." I kept smiling, stepping back, cleaning up. I erased myself gently. One day, one gesture, one silence at a time. I wasn't loud about my needs. Maybe I thought they were small. Maybe I believed love meant not needing anything in return. But now I know you can't be heard if you never speak, and no one can find you if you keep hiding behind everyone else. I folded the photos carefully, returning them to the drawer, not with resentment, but with quiet acceptance. Some memories don't need to be displayed, they need to be understood. And maybe, just maybe, it's time I learned to speak up, even if only to myself. I didn't plan it with drama. There were no packed bags by the door, no tearful goodbyes, just a slip of paper I left on the table, next to the empty teacup he hadn't noticed I'd stopped filling. I'm going away for a few days. I'm fine. Don't call. That was all. I left before the sun rose. The streets were still hushed, bathed in that pale blue light that makes everything seem softer than it is. I walked to the bus stop with steady steps, the morning air crisp on my face like something gently slapping me awake. The ride was long, winding through familiar roads that had grown unfamiliar with time. I hadn't been back to my mother's village in years, not since her funeral, not since I'd become too busy being everything for everyone. I sat near the window. The bus was filled with young people, students with earbuds, couples whispering, someone watching videos on a cracked phone. I watched them, quietly, their energy, their urgency, their unspoken belief that life would always open for them. And I smiled. I used to believe that too, a long time ago. When I stepped off the bus, the air smelled different, earthy, slower, with that hint of wood smoke and old leaves. The village hadn't changed much, the same crooked fence, the same tree bending over the river, the same silence. But somehow here, it felt kinder. I walked to the house that had belonged to my grandmother, then my mother. It stood empty now, dust settled on the windowsills, vines creeping along the side wall. Still, it felt like home, in a way my own house never quite had. I rolled up my sleeves and began to sweep, opened all the windows, let the breeze in, pulled weeds from the small garden until my hands ached, watered the lemon tree she once planted, now twisted and taller than the roof. That night, I sat on the porch with a blanket over my knees. No TV, no plates to wash, just crickets, wind, and the stars above. I laughed softly to myself when I found the old music box in a drawer. It still played, though the tunes skipped here and there. A song I hadn't heard since I was a girl, humming it in my mother's kitchen, imagining the life ahead. No one called, no one asked where I was, and, strangely, I didn't feel empty. I didn't feel forgotten. I felt full, in a way that had nothing to do with being needed, and everything to do with being here, with the soil, the sky, and myself. Maybe this was the first time in my life I was truly keeping company with someone who had always waited quietly inside me, the woman I was before I forgot how to be her. In the weeks that followed, I began to learn how to live differently, not louder, not bolder, just slower, and more mine. I woke up without the sound of anyone else's alarm, made breakfast the way I liked it, soft rice porridge with ginger and just a little too much sesame oil. No one complained. No one pushed the bowl away. It was only me. And for the first time in years, that was enough. I took long walks in the morning, down old village paths lined with bamboo and low stone walls. Sometimes I carried a book in my shawl, the pages worn thin with memory. Other times I stitched slow, imperfect embroidery on handkerchiefs, little blue flowers, leaves that curled too much. They weren't beautiful, but they were mine. At the market, I ran into a few women I hadn't seen in decades. We used to sit together in school, braiding each other's hair. Now we stood beside baskets of herbs and dried fish, trading stories about aching knees and noisy grandchildren. They laughed about their husbands, their daughters-in-law, about forgetting where they'd put their reading glasses. I listened, and laughed too, the kind of laughter that doesn't try to impress or prove. Just laughter for the sake of being present. They invited me to join them at the temple next week. I said yes, without needing to check with anyone. One evening, I poured myself a glass of rice wine. Just one. I placed it gently on the table beside a dish of pickled mango. The chair I sat on was level, not lower, not wobbling, not bent from years of leaning. The moon was out, full, glowing, quiet as a prayer. I raised my glass, not in a toast to anyone, but to myself. Not because someone poured it for me, not because anyone was watching, but because, finally, I knew I was worth raising a glass to. I didn't need to be thanked to feel proud, didn't need to be noticed to feel seen. There was a calm blooming inside me, not loud, not showy, but steady. It didn't mean I stopped loving them. It didn't mean I erased the life I had lived. It just meant I remembered I was part of the story, too. Sometimes people think rebirth has to be big, loud, wild, full of flames. But sometimes life begins again with something as simple as a chair pulled forward, a chair made equal, a chair that says, "You belong here too." And sitting on that chair, under that moon, I finally believed it. My daughter arrived on a quiet afternoon, the sun slipping through the wooden slats of the porch. I heard her steps before I saw her, careful, hesitant, like she wasn't sure what version of me she'd find. She looked at me, eyes wide. I was just folding a scarf, nothing grand. But still, she paused. "You look different," she whispered. And I suppose I was. Not younger, not stronger, but lighter, like a heavy coat I'd worn for decades had finally been set down. She took my hand. There was a long silence, and then she said it. "I'm sorry, Mom. I'm sorry for letting you live like that for so long. I should have seen more. I should have asked." I smiled. Not from forgiveness, because there was nothing left to forgive. "And I'm sorry, too," I said softly, "for thinking that was all I deserved. For confusing sacrifice with love. For thinking being quiet was the same as being kind." We sat side by side on the porch, and I poured us both cups of tea. Steam curled gently between us. No need for apologies to fill every gap. We let the warmth speak. I began telling her stories, not the heavy ones, not with anger or bitterness, just truths, like folding old laundry pulled in from the line. Wrinkled, yes, but still clean, still mine. I told her about the rice I used to skip so her father could eat, about the times I sang to myself while hanging clothes, just to feel like someone was listening, about how I used to hold my breath when I passed mirrors, afraid they might show me someone I didn't want to see. She listened, and this time I felt heard. We didn't rewrite the past that day. We didn't need to, but we honored it. We dusted it off and placed it gently on the shelf, beside the present. I don't regret my life. I don't resent the years I gave. But I do feel a quiet ache for the woman I was standing in corners, smiling too much, asking too little. I wish I had loved her better. So now I will. And if you've lived like me, folding yourself small so others could feel tall, please remember, you don't need to sit lower to keep the peace. You don't have to shrink for others to feel comfortable. As long as you're breathing, as long as you're warm, you can begin again, even if your voice trembles, even if your hands shake, even if it starts with something as small as pulling up your own chair and pouring your own cup of tea. You are allowed to take up space, and it is never too late to sit at the table, equal and whole.